Hey there, I'm G. Welcome to another bite sized episode of the stuff you should think about. If you're anything like me, you spend a lot of time juggling career, a family, a Netflix queue, and maybe a side hustle or two. You probably don't have the luxury of sitting down with a philosophy textbook for an hour, but you do have a few minutes here and there. Whether you're on a bus waiting for the coffee to brew or chopping vegetables for dinner. That's the sweet spot where I step in. I hunt down answers to the everyday questions that pop up in our heads, and I bring them back to you in a quick conversational format you can listen to or read on the go. In today's episode, we'll dive into a classic thought experiment that has been puzzling ethicists, engineers, jurists, and even politicians for decades: the trolley problem. I'm not a moral philosopher, nor am I a legal scholar. I'm just a curious person who loves to untangle how ideas work, and I'm here to share what I've learned. No ivory tower jargon, just plain language and a few practical takeaways. If you enjoyed this deep dive, smash that subscribe button, drop a comment with a topic you'd love to hear me tackle next, and as always, stay curious. The Trolley Problem 101. What is it, really? If you've never heard of the trolley problem, picture this. A runaway trolley is barreling down the track toward 5 unsuspecting workers. You're standing next to a leveler that can divert the trolley onto a side track where, unfortunately, there's one lone worker. Do you pull the lever? That, in a nutshell, is the classic version of the trolley problem. First introduced by British philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967, and later popularized by Judith Jarrett in the 1970s. It's a thought experiment, which means it's a mental exercise rather than a real-world scenario. Its purpose: to tease out how we make moral decisions when we're forced to weigh lives against each other. Over the years, philosophers have spun dozens of variations, adding a Fat Man version, a Switch version, and even a loop version where the trolley path circles back on itself. But the core idea remains the same: a forced choice between two undesirable outcomes. Why does this matter? You might be thinking, okay, G, this is interesting, but I'll never have to decide which person to sacrifice in real life. That's true. But the underlying structure of the problem mirrors many modern dilemmas. Self-driving cars, deciding whether to swerve to avoid a pedestrian, potentially injuring passengers. Medical triage, in disaster zones where resources like ventilators or hospital beds are scarce. Military drones, programmed to minimize civilian casualties while neutralizing threats. In each case, a system, whether a vehicle, a hospital, or a weapon, must process information, evaluate outcomes, and act. Understanding the mechanics of the trolley problem can help us think more clearly about how we design, regulate, and ethically govern these systems. The mechanics. how the trolley problem works. Let's break down the problem step by step, as if we're looking at a flowchart. The decision point. Observation. You become aware that an imminent harm is about to occur. The trolley is speeding toward 5 workers. Information gathering. You know the possible outcomes. Do nothing. 5 die versus intervene, 1 dies. Choice. You have a single lever or switch that can change the trolley's trajectory. At this point, the mechanics of the problem are essentially a binary decision tree, action versus inaction, each leading to a distinct consequence. The variables. Number of lives at stake, which represents the quantitative measure of impact, and its example in real life are 5 patients versus 1 in a ICU triage. Where the agency is a variable, it represents whether you actively are causing harm or passively allowing it. And this example in real life is pulling a lever, active versus standing by, which is passive. Where intent is a variable, it represents your purpose behind the action. And its example in real life is aiming to minimize total deaths. Where predictability is a variable, it represents how certain you are about the outcomes, and its example in real life is in a self-driving car, sensor data predicts likely collision outcomes. And where moral framework is a variable, it represents the ethical lens you apply, whether it be utilitarian, deontological, or a virtue ethics. And its example in real life is choosing the greatest good for the greatest number versus respecting each individual rights. The process flow. First, you have input, and that's the data about the situation, who's on the track, speed, possible interventions. Next, you have evaluation, a mental or algorithmic calculation weighing the variables. Next, you have a decision rule, a pre-established principle which minimalizes total harm. That guides the choice. Next, you have the outcome. Pull the lever, press the button, or do nothing. And lastly, you have the outcome. The consequences are realized, and we can later reflect on the decision. By separating the process from the content, we can apply the same skeleton to any high-stakes, split-second decision, whether it's a human making a snap judgment or a machine executing pre-programmed logic. A brief history from philosophy classrooms to AI labs. Philosophical roots. The trolley problem sprouted from consequentialist philosophy, which asks, what outcome yields the most overall good? Utilitarian thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill laid the groundwork for this calculus of happiness. However, the problem also pulls in deontological ideas, those of Immanuel Kant, who argued that certain actions are intrinsically wrong, regardless of the consequence. What makes the trolley problem so seductive is that it forces these two camps to clash on concrete, which is a visceral scenario. Legal and constitutional backdrop. When philosophers debated, jurists and lawmakers began wrestling with similar dilemmas, often in the context of state action and individual rights. Two legal pillars underpin many modern discussions about the trolley problem. The First Amendment, U.S. Constitution. This guarantees freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Although it doesn't directly mention moral decision-making, it establishes a baseline for individual rights that must be respected, even when public safety is at risk. Supreme Court precedents. Cases like Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and Roe v. Wade, 1973, Roe versus Wade, 1973, though now overturned, reflect how the court balances individual liberties against societal interests. More relevant to our mechanical focus are decisions involving state duty to protect and the limits of governmental power, such as Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963, right to counsel, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992, the undue burden standard. These cases illustrate how the judiciary weighs competing harms and sometimes adopts a balancing test, a legal analog to the utilitarian calculus. When designers of autonomous systems look to law for guidance, they often reference the reasonableness standards set forth in cases like Graham versus Connor, 1989, use of force, which asked whether a decision was objectively reasonably given the circumstances, mirroring the decision point analysis of the trolley problem. From thought experiment to engineering blueprint. In the early 2000s, engineers at MIT's Media Lab and Stanford began using the trolley problem to test ethical algorithms for driverless cars. The famous Moral Machine project, launched by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2016, gathered millions of public opinions on how autonomous vehicles should resolve crash scenarios, essentially a massive data-driven version of our little mental puzzle. The project's findings revealed surprising bipartisan agreement on several points. More on that soon. Showing that while people differ on philosophy, they often converge on practical, human-centric solutions. Bipartisan ground, where both sides find common ground. You might think that a moral thought experiment would divide people along stark ideological lines, yet surveys, especially the massive moral machine data set, over 40 million decisions from 200-plus nationalities, show a pattern of cross-party consensus, where the issue is prioritizing the young, both liberals and conservatives overwhelmingly favor saving younger lives over older ones when all else is equal. And that's the majority view across the political spectrum, where the issue is protecting pedestrians. The majority view across political spectrum is there's a strong shared preference for protecting pedestrians over vehicle occupants in collision scenarios, where the issue is gender and disability. The majority view, people across the aisle lean toward do not discriminate based on gender, ability, or social status. where the issue is legal liability. The majority view is both sides support clear, transparent rules that assign liability to manufacturers rather than end users when autonomous systems make a split-second decision. These agreements suggest that while the philosophical underpinnings might differ, some lean heavily on utilitarianism, others on deontological rights. The pragmatic outcomes often align. In other words, the real-world implementation of trolley-type decisions can be built on a shared societal foundations, easing the path for policy and regulation. Legal lens: how the First Amendment and Supreme Court precedents shape the debate. Freedom of thought versus moral action. The First Amendment protects the freedom to think and express moral positions, but it does not guarantee an absolute right to enact any decision, especially when that decision interferes with another's life. In the trolley scenario, choosing to divert the trolley is an action that directly impacts another individual's right to life, something the Constitution does not shield. The Supreme Court has repeatedly emphasized that rights come with responsibilities in Katz versus the United States, 1967. The court recognized a reasonable expectation of privacy but balanced it against government interest. Translating that to our thought experiment, society's interest in preserving the greatest number of lives can, under certain circumstances, outweigh an individual's right not to be sacrificed. The balancing test in practice. One of the most cited doctrines is the balancing test, first articulated in Matthews versus Etheridge, 1976. It asks three questions. One is the private interest affected. Another one is the risk of erroneous deprivation. And the third one is the value of the government interest. If we map this into one trolley problem, private interest, the right to life of each individual on the tracks, risk of erroneous deprivation, the chance that pulling the lever might not actually prevent the 5 deaths. An example would be mechanical failure. And the government interest, the societal desire to minimize total loss of life. Supreme Court decisions often swing in favor of the governmental or societal interest. When the private interest is life or liberty and the risk of error is low, that gives us a legal foothold for arguments that utilitarian outcomes, saving the most lives, can be justified under constitutional law, provided due process and reasonable safeguards are in place. Multiple solutions for a single goal, from ethics to engineering. Now that we've mapped the mechanics, history, and legal scaffolding, let's explore concrete solutions that aim to achieve the same overarching goal: minimizing loss of life while respecting individual rights. Each approach reflects a different ethical lens but ultimately strives for the same outcome. Utilitarian algorithm, the greatest good model. What it looks like. An autonomous system calculates the unexpected number of casualties for each possible action and selects the option with the lowest total loss. Pros: it's straightforward, quantifiable, aligns with many public preferences, as we saw in the moral machine data. Cons: it can appear cold, reducing individuals to numbers, may overlook rights that some deem inviolable. i.e., do not sacrifice a single innocent life, even to save many. Deontological restraint. The rule-based model. What it looks like. The system follows a hard-coded rule: never actively cause a death, even if that means allowing a larger loss. In the trolley scenario, this would mean not pulling lever. Pros respect the principle that actively harming someone is morally worse than passively allowing harm. And the con, it may lead to higher total casualties and can clash with public expectations of doing something. Virtue ethics, heuristic, the character-centric model. What it looks like. The decision engine incorporates contextual cues like proximity, relationship, and social role, mirroring how a compassionate person might act. For example, the system might prioritize protecting children or individuals who are known to be vulnerable. A pro, it adds a human-like empathy layer, and it can be tuned to cultural values. Cons, harder to formalize, and it may introduce bias, e.g., ageism, ableism, if not carefully audited. Hybrid framework. The best of both model. What it looks like. Combine a utilitarian baseline with a deontological safeguards. The system first checks if any action would actively cause a death. If not, it uses a utility calculation to choose the safest path. The pros are it balances the moral intuition that killing is worse with the practical need to reduce overall harm. The cons are complexity increases, and it requires transparent governance to avoid hidden trade-offs. Democratic oversight, the public input model. What it looks like. Policymakers involve citizens directly through referendums or public consultations to set the moral preference encoded in autonomous systems. Pros, it enhances legitimacy, reflects bipartite, census, and cultural norms. Cons, public opinion can be volatile, may not keep pace with technological change. Transparent personal bias. My own take without pretending to be an expert. Okay, confession time. While I'm not a philosopher, I do lean a bit toward the hybrid framework. The idea that we can respect the moral instinct not to take a life while striving to save as many lives as possible. Why? Because human intuition tends to recoil at the idea of directly causing a death, even if it prevents a larger tragedy. The legal precedent, the balancing test, suggests that any active infringement on life must be tightly scrutinized. Public data, the moral machine, shows that people want clear, transparent rules and that avoid playing God in a way that feels arbitrary. That said, I'm aware that my personal bias is colored by my upbringing in a community that values collective welfare and individual dignity equally. I encourage you, dear listener, to examine your own intuitions and see where they land on the spectrum. The beauty of the trolley problem is that it doesn't demand a single answer. It sparks curiosity, conversation, and hopefully better policies. Historical parallels, real-world trolley moments. Philosophers love thought experiments, but history provides real trolley type moments where societies had to decide who lives and who doesn't. In the Manhattan Project in 1945, the trolley decision was choose to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the war quickly, sacrificing civilian lives to potentially save millions of soldiers. The outcome shows the utilitarian calculus in action, but also the long-term moral fallout, which is radiation and civilian trauma. In the civilian triage decision, 1918, the Spanish flu, doctors had to decide which patient received the limited supply of anti-serum. The outcome was it introduced triage protocols, a systematic approach to allocate scarce resources based on severity and survivability. In the Moscow bomb plot in 1995, Russian authorities intercepted a plot to bomb a commuter train, deciding whether to shut down the line, disrupting thousands, or risk the attack. The outcome, they demonstrated preventive action, pulling the lever based on probabilistic forecast. In the Boston Marathon bombing 2013, law enforcement faced a choice: use legal force against a suspect who might have surrendered. And the outcome was they highlighted the deontological concern of not killing unless absolutely necessary, even under high pressure. These episodes reveal that the mechanics of the trolley problem, information gathering, risk assessment, moral weighting, and decisive action are not just academic. They are embedded in every high-stakes decision we make as society. Some takeaways that you should walk away with. The trolley problem isn't a puzzle you solve once. It's a lens for examining any decision where you must choose between harms. Mechanics matter. Break the scenario into inputs, evaluation, rules, action, and outcome. You'll see the underlying structure clear. History, law, and public opinion converge on certain non-negotiables, protecting the vulnerable, avoiding arbitrary discrimination, and ensuring transparent accountability. Multiple ethical frameworks can coexist. A hybrid model often best reflects the nuance of real-world moral landscapes. Your own bias is a feature, not a flaw. Acknowledging it helps you engage more authentically with the debate. In short, the trolley problem teaches us how to think, not what to think. And that, dear listeners, is a skill you can apply far beyond trains and levers. Whether you're reviewing a policy brief, programming an AI system, or simply deciding what's right in a personal dilemma. And that's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in or reading to this deep dive into how trolley problems work. I hope you found a fresh perspective that will stick with you next time you're faced with a tough decision, big or small. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button so you won't miss future bites of curiosity. Feel free to download, leave a comment, or suggest a phenomenon you'd love for me to unpack next. You can find us on whatever platform you listen to your podcast. This podcast is for informational purposes only. All statements are based on current scientific understanding, historical records, and public policy. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep asking the right questions. I'm G, and I'm out.